Some of our citizens wonder why Russia and every Russian has turned out to be an enemy to the entire collective West. We know that Americans opposed the Soviet Union, and US President Ronald Reagan, in a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals in the United States, called the Soviet Union an evil empire. But never has there been so much outright Russophobia towards the people of Russia. Scientists, athletes and ordinary citizens of the Soviet Union were not persecuted and were respected in Western society. And this at a time when the borders of both countries were patrolled around the clock by strategic bombers with nuclear weapons on board, ready to strike at any moment. But what's happening today? The phenomenon of rejection of Russia, Russian culture and even ordinary Russians strikes even former political figures. How did this happen, given all that Russia was for the countries of the collective West, given how obedient our country used to be and let them do literally anything they wanted? This question is best answered by Americans themselves. For example, John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, during a speech at the CIS Center for Independent Studies, called the current Russia a superpower. Just with one correction. Russia exactly became a superpower, and in spite of everything the Western countries did. And it happened, according to the professor, solely thanks to President Vladimir Putin. China is also a superpower, according to the professor, as is the US. Except that China became a superpower thanks to the unlimited investments of the entire collective West in the development of the Celestial Empire's economy for 50 years, and Russia only thanks to the policies of Vladimir Putin's team. But he's not Superman, he's just a man. To quote, "We consider Russia a superpower because Vladimir Putin, when he came to power in 2000, brought Russians back from the dead. In the 1990s, Russia essentially died, and there were no prerequisites for its recovery." End quote by John Mearsheimer. That was a pretty candid performance. The Western world could do whatever it wanted to the Russians, and it did. But no politician, even the most astute, can single-handedly bring Russia back from the dead. It would seem, at the time, the entire Russian elite was too friendly to the West. Huge amounts of capital were withdrawn from Russia by their hands in the early 90s and early 2000s. Their children had previously studied there, they had residency permits, assets and money. They would, some thought, only need to be frightened just a little and they would miraculously regroup in midair and go all out for the embrace of the Western world. But this elite, mercilessly fed by the West for 30 years, did not even dare to oppose Vladimir Putin. And those who dared to do so are now forced to renounce Russian citizenship on their own, with all the consequences that entails, or to admit their mistakes. Like Friedman, for example, quote, "We genuinely thought we were such good friends of the Western world that we couldn't be punished," he said in an interview with the US news agency Bloomer after returning to Russia. Betting on the so-called rich businessmen did not play, and then the Western world decided to cancel the Russian man, starting to spread total Russophobia. The Russian population in the eyes of Western politicians will never support such a thing. Because in 30 years, a generation of Russians with a pro-Western mindset has supposedly grown up. Their adherence to Western values has been repeatedly proven and demonstrated at numerous rallies against the Russian power structures. Here, for example, are the protest movements in Russia in 2011 to 2013, the so-called Canvas Revolution and the Snow Revolution. The inaction of the Russian people, who in their majority did not take to the streets and rally for the lifting of sanctions, for a change of political regime, for concessions to the collective West, and so on, all caused cognitive dissonance in Washington, London and Brussels. At the same time, support for the government among Russians has only grown since the sanctions were imposed, reaching phenomenal results. That's the level of trust in politicians. The sums of the answers are certainly trustworthy and rather trustworthy. At the same time, while earlier supporters of Vladimir Putin were afraid to speak openly about their position among their colleagues, now those who used to be in favor of the then opposition have begun to be considered unhealthy people. And then supporters of such figures began to recant their former preferences, saying they were young and foolish or that they were misguided. The West sees this very well. So the rejection of Russian politics began to grow into a rejection of all things Russian. Well, what has Russia so displeased the West? Just because we wanted some sovereignty or self-sufficiency? Something's not right here. Yes, the former hegemony of the US has already been undone. Now they are no longer capable of dominating the world, and this was perfectly demonstrated by the collective imposition of anti-Russian sanctions, which 2/3 of the rest of the world did not join. But imposing direct sanctions against ordinary Russian citizens just because they are Russian is overkill. Here Germany has started confiscating personal belongings of both entering and leaving Russians, cash, phones, laptops, cars, cosmetics and even clothes. Here is an example of sanctions against every Russian. This can only happen in one case, in the complete and unqualified despair of the Western world from its failed attempts to subjugate Russia. They realize that Russia's new elite will no longer trust the West. There will be no more new naval and swamp squares in Russia either. Russia has now become a superpower whose economy has stood up to the strongest sanctions ever imposed in history. The Russian people rallied, while some of the former pro-Western elite huddled in a corner out of fright. Former liberal leaders who once garnered tens of millions of views on YouTube are now perceived by Russian society as proxies of the West, who have fled abroad, are simply as clowns whose opinions no longer count. And all these rapid changes occurred in such a short time that the West failed to realize the underlying causal factors. That's where the roots of dislike for Russia and everything Russian grow from. They are very much afraid of us, more afraid than they were of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was clear, just as it was clear how to oppose it without hurting ourselves. How to counter China is also quite calculable. But Russia is different. It is essentially a phoenix bird, reborn from the ashes, in defiance of the actions of the Western world. 30 years of pro-Western education of an entire generation of Russians, 30 years of noodles of pro-Western liberal value. The feeding troughs of our businessmen and everything else lost any meaning overnight. And now the main task of the Western world is to eliminate Russia's leader, to eliminate the man with whom the West associates the revival of Russia. Therefore, the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. And then the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, PACE, voted unanimously not to recognize Vladimir Putin's legitimacy as president if he is re-elected in the 2024 elections. It was not possible to achieve Putin's departure in a democratic way in quotes with the help of rallies of thousands. Now they are directly prohibiting Russians from voting for him in the upcoming elections. And here it doesn't matter anymore how one feels about the president, whether one approves of his policies or not. They want to take away our right to choose, even in our own country. This is a direct violation of the basic principle enshrined in the UN Charter, the right of peoples to self-determination. That is, the whole essence of the UN was flushed down the toilet with a slight movement of PACE members. According to the West, the right of peoples to self-determination is not a right at all, but a privilege available only to a select few. Here is the decision of PACEM, in their opinion, is in the interests of the people of Russia first of all, but also in the interests of Europe and the whole world. Except they don't understand the most important thing, that after Putin will come a man who will be ceremonious with them is certainly not going to happen. Because it's a different time, whether the Western world likes it or not. And a professor of political science at the University of Chicago made this quite clear in a recent speech. To quote, "I think in the rivalry between us and the Russians will win," Professor John Marshmeyer summarized. But you know what's the scariest thing for the Western world? No, it is not the establishment of a multipolar world where the interests of the opponent will have to be taken into account, and it is not even the threat of nuclear war. What could be worse? The worst thing for them is to build a just world order initiated by Russia. And it seems that some countries have already begun to gradually accept the inevitable arrival of the New World Order. For example, French President Emmanuel Macron was eager to attend the BRICS Congress. But he was denied. However, the probing of the ground continued. General Charles de Gaulle's grandson asked Vladimir Putin about the possibility of France joining BRICS, to which Putin promised to consider France's application if it formally submitted it. By doing so, the French political top brass made it clear that a dialogue on France's accession to BRICS is quite possible. And then the American newspaper The Wall Street Journal started publishing atypical articles with strange headlines. Like, "It's time to end the West's magical musings about Russia's defeat. Putin has withstood every attempt by the West to stop him. Power. His strength is stronger than ever." What's that? One of the stages of accepting the inevitable? The first stage of denial and isolation, the imposition of sanctions and trade restrictions, the main purpose of which was to isolate Russia's economy, has already taken place. The second stage, anger, spreading Russophobia, sanctions against all Russian citizens has already happened. The third step is bargaining. Today's stage of accepting the inevitability of the restoration of independent statehood in Russia, its emergence as a superpower and as a new world power. And then the fourth stage is depression and the fifth stage is acceptance. It won't be long now.